Aristotle's ethics belongs to a group of moral theories called virtue ethics. Recall that virtue ethics is a normative ethical theory centering on moral character. In this moral theory, actions aim to manifest moral virtues. The moral action is decided by answering the question, what is the virtuous thing to do? Or what is the generous thing to do? Or what is the courageous thing to do? A lot of ancient philosophers were virtue ethicists, and when I say ancient, I mean primarily Greek, Roman, and Chinese ethicists. Recall that last week we looked at Mencius's virtue theory. Key ideas from Mencius are that humans are naturally good, we're all born with the innate moral senses or sprouts that can develop into full virtues or virtuous characteristics. And these moral sprouts develop, and we develop these moral sprouts by a kind of cultivation. We cultivate our innate moral sprouts into full virtues by focusing on them. Specifically, we need to focus on our feelings, thoughts, unreflective reactions, and impressions about morally relevant situations. We turn now to Aristotle's approach to virtue ethics, because he takes ethics seriously as a practical knowledge. Like health and medicine or navigation are practical knowledges, Aristotle thinks that ethics works in the similar way. This means that, this means that Aristotle argues we develop moral virtues by practicing moral actions and imitating moral exemplars, or imitating those we observe to be morally good people. And that our way to developing our moral virtues is through practice of moral actions and imitating moral exemplars rather than paying close attention to our own moral senses and reactions. We'll be looking specifically at Aristotle on moral virtue, as presented in the second book of his text called Nicomachean Ethics. Recall that Mencius wrote the Mencius after wandering around China discussing ethics and philosophy and politics with various rulers. In other words, Mencius's text represents his concern for educating people on how to be good because of the political fallout that can happen when young people don't learn to care about ethics and then grow up to wield power. In a similar vein, Aristotle also sought to educate the young men of Athens about becoming good. His text, the Nicomachean Ethics, was named for his son Nicomachus, and Aristotle's goal throughout the text really is to show the young future leaders of his community why being good is good for others as well as for the self. Aristotle builds his moral philosophy upon two concepts. We will not dive as far into them as we could, but we do need to address them at least in part. These concepts are 1, our human function, or the function argument, and 2, happiness, or eudaimonia. The function argument goes more or less as follows. Premise 1, all things have a function, understood as a thing they're supposed to do. Premise 2, the function of a thing is determined by the kind of thing it is. And premise 3, humans are rational and social things. Therefore, the human function will be rational and social activity. So living a life in accordance with these activities is doing one's human function well. And that just is eudaimonia for Aristotle. Aristotle argues that happiness just is the term for when human beings fulfill their natural potentials for excellent social and rational activity. In other words, all things have a natural function, i.e., we can think of this as a kind of purpose, and humans are no exception. We are kinds of things. We are a kind of thing. The goodness of a thing resides in its ability to perform its proper function. Take, for example, a flute player. A good flute player is one who plays the flute well, but a flute player who is not good is actually also trying to play the flute well. So the function of a flute player is to play the flute, and all flute players are trying to play the flute as best as they can, are trying to be good flute players. Or we could think of a knife. The function of a knife is to cut. A good knife cuts well, but the function of any knife is to cut as best as it can. So likewise, human beings are social, rational creatures. Good humans live lives characterized by excellent social and rational activity. And such a life is a happy life, according to Aristotle. Such a life is a eudaimon life. And this is the end that all humans strive for, which will be achieved by striving for fulfilling our natural purpose for social and rational activity. To expand a little more on this idea, for Aristotle, a thing's function, or its end or its purpose, is determined by its nature, meaning the kind of thing that it is. Everything has a function and is good to the extent that it succeeds at its function, and it is bad to the extent that it doesn't. In living things, the function of a thing directs that thing's life or existence, like an acorn. An acorn has the function, has the end, the purpose of growing into a big, flourishing oak tree, for example. And that end directs that acorn's lifespan and activity. Or in other words, some purpose or future ideal causes or motivates the being and the motion of a thing. The actions taken to achieve that end are caused, are motivated by, are directed by the end itself. By nature, living things have a drive to do what they are meant to do and to do it well. The human function is determined by human nature as a rational and social animal, and directed at eudaimonia, or happiness, which will be achieved in the activity characteristic of our human function and nature. So Aristotle connects our human function, our characteristic activities of social and of a social and rational nature, with happiness, or eudaimonia. So let's take a closer look at what Aristotle means by happiness then. Eudaimonia is a Greek word where we have the EU is a prefix meaning good, and daimonia is a sort of conceptualized noun of the noun daimon, which just means sort of a spirit, or often it is a word to literally indicate a minor deity. So taking the kind of good or blessedness plus the spirit aspect of daimon, we get this idea of eudaimonia as a kind of blessedness. In the translations of Aristotle's text, we see eudaimonia translated often as happiness, but also often as flourishing or well-being. Most translators now prefer flourishing or well-being because of the connotations of the word happiness, as well as the kind of ambiguity about the nature of happiness. It is not ambiguous what eudaimonia means for Aristotle. But when we say happiness in the 21st century, we kind of carry into thinking about this word all of these ideas we already have that are not Aristotelian. So, for example, happiness is very often thought of as more of a mood than a state of being. But Aristotle's understanding of eudaimonia is not a mood, it is not a momentary feeling, but rather this is an overall evaluation of the status of one's life as going well, as fulfilling, as containing all of those things that we expect to be present in a good life. Things like meaningful relationships, things like decent health, or health care for when our organic bodies don't remain healthy. Things like having certain material conditions met so that we're not having to focus all of our energy on finding food or finding housing, as well as meaningful work, right? Ways in which we can apply our rational and social activities. These sort of whole package is what eudaimonia as a concept is trying to capture, and this is why happiness is not a perfect translation for it. Eudaimonia is the only thing sought for its own sake, and it is not sought as a means to any other thing. We do not want to be happy in order to be some additional state, or achieve some additional accomplishment, or have some additional thing. Happiness is desired for its own sake and is final in that most final sense of not pursued for the purposes of pursuing something else afterwards. So we We pursue food because we are hungry, or we pursue activities because they are fun. This is sort of the structure, right? But with happiness, we don't pursue happiness for some other reason. And like as I sort of mentioned, right, to achieve happiness, there will be certain external goods outside of our control that will be required. Things like being born into the right state or the right family, as well as having certain material conditions met.